A homeless man stopped JD Vance on the street, asking for just $1. What happened next left the entire crowd stunned. It was one of those afternoons in downtown Cincinnati, clouds threatening rain but never delivering. The air carried the scent of damp pavement and fast food grease, a mix of the city's pulse and its quiet neglect. Pedestrians moved with their usual rhythm, some with purpose, others lost in thought. JD Vance blended into the crowd, walking steadily, hands tucked in his jacket pockets. Dressed casually, he didn't stand out, yet people noticed. Some whispered, recognizing him from TV or the headlines. Then, a voice broke through the city noise. "Hey man, can you spare $1?" Vance had heard it before. Usually, it was a quick nod or a polite shake of the head, but something about this was different. Maybe the way the man's voice wavered or how he avoided eye contact. The man was thin not just from hunger, but the kind that hollows out cheeks, makes eyes look bigger. His mismatched layers spoke of survival, not style. His beard was patchy, hands cracked from exposure. He wasn't aggressive, just waiting, as if he expected nothing. Vance stopped. "What's your name?" The man blinked, caught off guard. Hesitating, he muttered, "Eddie." People passed by, barely noticing. Vance, however, didn't move. Something about Eddie kept him there, his slumped shoulders, his quiet dignity. "You live around here?" Vance asked. Eddie let out a humorless chuckle. "I live wherever I can." Vance nodded but didn't reach for his wallet. Instead, he asked, "How long have you been out here?" Eddie glanced at the street, debating whether to keep talking or walk away. "Too long." Eddie finally spoke. Vance exhaled, his breath visible in the cool air. He could feel eyes on him now. Someone had stopped nearby, maybe eavesdropping, maybe recording. It didn't matter. What he said next would. Eddie shifted, stuffing his hands into his oversized jacket. The fabric, stiff and faded, clung to his thin frame. His fingers curled inside the pockets, gripping nothing, as if the motion itself kept them warm. Most politicians would have already walked away or, at best, tossed a few dollars before moving on. But Vance didn't reach for his wallet. Eddie noticed. His expression flickered, expectation turning to quiet disappointment, as if he had already rehearsed this outcome in his mind. "I just need $1, he repeated, softer this time, as if lowering the price might change the answer. Vance glanced down the street. A small group had started watching, a man leaning against a light post, a woman slowing her pace, a teenager hovering with his hands in his hoodie pocket. The city had a way of turning private moments into public spectacle. Vance looked back at Eddie. "What would you do with it?" Eddie let out a humorless chuckle. "Ain't that the question?" But Vance wasn't joking. Eddie's face hardened. $1 don't get you much these days," he muttered. "Maybe a coffee, maybe some bread if you know where to go." A pause. Then, quieter. Or maybe just a moment where I don't feel like nothing. Something in the way he said, it lingered between them. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't begging. It was just true. Vance's jaw tightened. He glanced at Eddie's hands, still shifting inside his pockets. "You used to work?" Eddie gave a bitter laugh. "Yeah, before life got in the way." "What was the job?" "Plumber." "Residential work. Fix leaky pipes, replace busted water heaters." He shook his head. Ain't much demand for a guy with no fixed address. Vance didn't argue. He'd heard stories like this before. Some people fell through the cracks so fast they barely had time to brace for impact. Eddie rubbed his chin. "So, you gonna give me $1 or what?" Another pause. Then Vance said something no one expected. "I'll give you something better." Eddie's brow furrowed. "Man, I ain't a skin for a sermon." "It's not a sermon," Vance replied. Eddie stared, wary. The street noise seemed to quiet, as if the city itself was waiting to see what would happen next. But whatever Vance had in mind, it wasn't going to be simple. Eddie shifted his weight, bracing himself for the usual lecture about bootstraps and personal responsibility. But Vance didn't launch into a speech. Instead, he asked, "When's the last time someone gave you a real shot?" Eddie frowned, caught off guard. "What? Like a job?" "Like anything." He let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "Been a while?" Vance nodded. "You ever try to get off the streets?" Eddie scoffed, rubbing the side of his face. "You think I want to be out here? Shelters are full before I even get in the door. Jobs? They tell me to come back when I got a phone, an address." He laughed bitterly. "Like I can pull that out of thin air." Vance crossed his arms, listening. Eddie shook his head. "You ever been homeless?" "No." Eddie smirked. "Yeah, didn't think so." Vance tilted his head slightly. "But I've been poor." Eddie studied him differently, now still skeptical, but maybe a little less dismissive. "Yeah?" Vance nodded. "Grew up cold, hungry. Went to school wearing the same clothes too, 3 days in a row." Eddie sniffed, rubbing his nose with the back of his hand. "Bet you had a way out." Vance held his gaze. Took a while. A small crowd had gathered, people lingering, watching. A man with a baseball cap pretended to check his phone, but was clearly recording. A woman whispered something to her friend, eyes flicking between Vance and Eddie. Eddie exhaled sharply. "So what? You gonna tell me to work harder?" Vance shook his head. "No." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. Eddie eyed it warily. "What's that?" "A name." "A number." Eddie didn't take it. "For what?" "Someone who can help? Housing first. No strings." Eddie scoffed. "Yeah, right. Ain't that easy?" Vance didn't lower his hand. "No, it's not. But it's real." Eddie hesitated. He had been given empty promises before flyers for shelters that were already full. Numbers for programs with months-long waiting lists. He wasn't sure if this was any different. But something about Vance's face, the way he wasn't smiling, wasn't trying to sell anything, made Eddie pause. "Why are you doing this?" Vance's answer was simple. "Because someone once did it for me." And not everyone agreed with what was happening. Eddie stared at the folded paper in Vance's hand like it was a loaded question. He had seen handouts before, flyers for soup kitchens, worn-out business cards from social workers who never answered, crumpled pamphlets from churches offering prayers instead of solutions. But something about this moment felt different. Eddie finally reached out and took the paper, unfolding it with rough fingers, his hands unsteady from the cold. The name written inside meant nothing to him. The number didn't either. It could have been real, or just another dead end. He exhaled sharply through his nose. "So that's it? No dollar?" A few people in the small crowd scoffed. Someone muttered something under their breath. The man with the baseball cap adjusted his phone, still recording. Vance stayed calm. Would a dollar really help? Eddie let out a bitter chuckle. "Wouldn't hurt." Vance held his gaze. "Wouldn't change anything either." Eddie clenched his jaw. "Man, I ain't asking you to save me. Just asked for a damn dollar." Another scoff from the crowd. A woman off to the side shook her head. "Just give him the money, man." Vance ignored the voices. "You said you worked before plumbing, right?" Eddie exhaled hard. "Yeah. What about it?" Vance pulled out his phone. "I know a guy in Dayton. Runs a contracting business, always looking for workers. He'll take a chance on people who need a second shot." Eddie squinted. "You serious?" Vance nodded. "I make the call. You show up, you work, you get paid." "No games," the crowd stirred. A teenager in a hoodie whispered something to his friend. A man near the curb shook his head and muttered, "Politicians, man. Always a stunt." Eddie let out a dry laugh. "So let me get this straight. I asked for a dollar, and you're trying to give me a job?" Vance's expression didn't change. "I'm trying to give you a way out." Eddie's grip tightened on the paper. He could feel every eye on him, waiting to see what he'd do. The weight of it all pressed down, heavier than he expected. His breath felt heavy in his chest. A job, a real shot, not a dollar, not a pity-filled pat on the shoulder. Something bigger. Yet, the weight of all the eyes on him made his skin itch. He could feel the judgment from those nearby, those with homes to return to, warm beds, lives that didn't involve asking for change. You going to take it or what? The man with the grocery bag challenged, voice sharp with disbelief and irritation. Eddie glared. What's it to you? The man scoffed. I've seen guys like you 100 times. Always an excuse. Always a reason why something ain't good enough. Eddie clenched his jaw. You don't know a damn thing about me. The man laughed dryly. I know you ain't worked in years. I know you're begging instead of trying. And I know you won't take that offer. If you do, you'll quit the second it gets hard. The words hit harder than Eddie wanted to admit. His grip on the paper tightened. A small part of Eddie wondered if he still had it in him to wake up early, push through exhaustion, show up, and prove himself. But another side whispered, what if this is another lie? He turned to Vance. And what happens if this is bullshit? If I show up and they ain't got nothing for me? Vance didn't blink. Then you call me. Eddie narrowed his eyes. Call you? Vance nodded, holding up his phone. If they don't give you work, you call me, and I'll find you something else. A murmur went through the crowd. The teenager in a hoodie whispered to his friend. The man with the grocery bag scoffed but stayed silent. Eddie's heart pounded. It felt too real. He had spent so long expecting to be ignored, to be invisible. Now, this an offer. A lifeline scared him. I don't even got a phone, he muttered. Without hesitation, Vance handed him a small black burner phone. The crowd went silent. Now you do. Eddie stared at the phone, his breath uneven. No one had ever done this for him before. He felt the weight of the moment. And then, as if on cue, someone in the crowd spoke, shattering the intensity. This is all for show. Eddie's grip tightened on the phone. His heart clenched at the accusation. The man, in his 50s, with a salt and pepper beard and a worn flannel shirt, stared at Vance, arms crossed, his face hard. His voice was laced with suspicion. This some kind of political stunt? Cameras are rolling. People are watching, and suddenly you're out here saving a homeless man? What happens when they stop watching? Murmurs rippled through the onlookers. Some nodded in agreement, others looked uncertain. Vance met the man's stare without flinching. You think I did this for attention? The man scoffed. Ain't that what politicians do? Eddie glanced between them, something twisting in his gut. He didn't want to believe that's what this was. He didn't want to think he was just another pawn in someone else's story. But that doubt, so familiar, so deeply ingrained, crept back in. Vance didn't raise his voice. He didn't defend himself with flashy words. He simply said, what I did today doesn't change, just because people are watching. If you think it does, that says more about the world you've seen than it does about me. The man in the flannel didn't respond right away. He just shook his head, muttering something under his breath before walking off. A woman in the crowd spoke next. So what happens now? Eddie blinked, realizing the question was aimed at him. Now, the question rattled around in his chest. He had the phone. He had the number. He had the chance. But was he really going to take it? He licked his lips, glancing down at the burner phone one more time before stuffing it into his pocket. Guess I make a call, he muttered. It was the smallest commitment he could make. Just a call. Just a first step. Vance nodded. That's all you gotta do. Eddie shifted his weight. And if I screw it up, you try again. Eddie let out a slow breath. He didn't know if this would change his life. He didn't know if this was another false hope or the real thing. But for the first time in a long time, he had something, a name, a number, a phone. And maybe, just maybe, a second chance. Vance stepped back. giving him space. No pressure, no theatrics, just a simple truth left hanging in the air. Somewhere in the crowd, a phone camera clicked off. A few people walked away, shaking their heads, still debating whether what they had just witnessed was real or not. But for Eddie, it didn't matter what they thought. This wasn't about them. It was about whether or not he was ready to fight for himself again. He took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and walked away, this time with something in his pocket that wasn't just another empty promise. Not every opportunity comes in the form we expect. Some don't come at all. But when they do, when someone reaches out and says, "I see you," the hardest part isn't taking the help. It's believing you deserve it. Maybe Eddie makes that call. Maybe he doesn't. But the lesson here isn't about a guaranteed outcome. It's about what happens when we stop assuming people are beyond saving and start treating them like they still matter. If this story made you think, share it. You never know who might need to hear it today. And if you've ever had a second chance, drop a comment below. Because sometimes knowing someone else made it through is all the hope a person needs. Make sure you're subscribed for more stories that challenge the way we see the world.